We're pleased to have our two speakers this evening, Coy McCorkle from the Hughes Seminole County unit. He's going to be discussing hay storage and feeding, and then kind of a last minute request to Mike Trammell, our Pottawatomie County educator and area agronomist, and he's going to cover a balanced forage system. We'll turn the floor over to him.
Well, we're going to discuss hay storage and feeding this evening. Like Justin said, I work in Hughes and Seminole County. So we'll try and get through this. Hopefully most of it will be review for most folks. But we'll move through it pretty quick. And if you got questions, all you got to do is stop us and ask, or put it in the chat, and Justin will stop us and we'll go from there. The one thing about hay production, everybody's got to cut it. Everybody's got to bale it, but depending on how you do it, not everybody has to rake it. So that's really, when it comes to cutting it and rolling it up, that's where the opportunity is going to lie. Depending on which kind of hay that you're putting up, what you're cutting, what you're baling with, you may be forced to have to rake it as well. Over here where I'm at, it's 99% grass hay, and they're all cut with just an old disc mower. And so just about everything over here is raked. But I know if you're putting up alfalfa, you don't want to have to be raking. If you don't have to, you're going to lose those leaves, and that's the best part of the hay bale. Also, kind of here on the top right, we got some tedders. That's becoming a lot more popular in my part of the world. I got two neighbors I know that bought tedders this year, just trying to get the hay to dry down faster. Both of them with the intention they're going to try and put up some small grain forage this spring coming up. They tried last year and we couldn't get enough dry time to get it rolled and get it baled up properly. One of those guys wound up, after it got rained on for about 3 weeks straight, he just burned it and punted and tried again. But over the course of the summer, he brought him a tedder. So a lot of options there. A lot of different timings come into play if you're trying to keep those leaves on your legumes, and some different methods to try and dry down hay a little faster to hit those windows. If you miss the window and you start talking about rain damage, typical losses for 1 inch of rain, you're going to lose somewhere between 8-17% of your dry matter. Your crude protein is going to go down between 1.5% and 2%. And then your fiber, or nutrient detergent fiber, and your TDN, it's going to affect those about 6 and 7% each. And TDN being your energy. So a lot of our grass hays, really good grass hay, you might have a TDN of the high 50s or right around 60. You get 1 inch of rain on it and you lose 7%, drops it down into the low 50s. It kind of lowers the quality of that hay pretty quick. So that kind of yields a lot of truth to the saying, you got to make your hay while the sun shines. You see the two different graphs there show alfalfa and clover, and the effects that the different amounts of rain had on each one of those. And it's kind of odd, as we got more rain, the red clover protein actually went up instead of down. But that's not something I'd bank on. And honestly, I don't know many people who cut a lot of red clover and roll it up into hay bales. So our next one's about storage, and everybody's got the same problem, whether you own a few sheep or a few goats or 100 head of cows. You're going to have to store hay. And then it just gives us some loss breakdowns over different methods that we can store our hay in. If you're putting it under the roof, that's open sided and just covered from the top, you can still expect somewhere between 2 and 10% loss. But if you drop all the way down and it's just uncovered and out on the ground, depending on what kind of hay you've got, your losses could be as high as 60%. So hopefully there's a few things you can do that will decrease that quite a bit. The one thing you can't do probably is move across the state. If you're way out west somewhere, you're going to have a lot less loss uncovered on the ground just because you have a lot less rainfall. The further south and east you happen to live, the more rainfall you get, the higher chances your losses are going to go up if you're storing outside on the ground. So what can we do? The best thing to do is store it smartly. You want to put that on a well-drained with a slight slope if you've got it. Hopefully somewhere you've got a spot that meets that criteria. Best thing you can do is line it up in a north-south direction in tight rows. So you can kind of see the picture there. You want to butt the flat side of those bales up, squeeze them in there as hard as you can. You can see the indentions from that front end loader where he's pushed those in as tight as he can get them. 3 to 4 foot between rows. That's important because you want to have airflow down in between those rows. You want to get the ground dry as quickly as possible. That's where the well-drained slight slope comes in, a little bit of space between the rows to let the air blow through. And that dictates the north-south direction because most of the time our wind is blowing out of the north or the south here in Oklahoma. Not stacked. That means you don't want to put them in a pyramid shape. You don't want to stand them on the flat side and stack 2 or 3 of them on top of each other either. Both of those allow more moisture to come in. Those round bales shed water around the round part and off the sides, and gravity helps with that. If that bale's flat on its end and it's got a flat top, gravity can't do anything but pull it down into the hay bale. Doesn't help you any. And then if you're stacking them in a pyramid shape, you run into the same problem. The water runs off the top bale down into like a trough between the top bale and the one underneath it. And then that water can't go anywhere but to soak into the hay bale. So both those are bad options. Best thing you do is expose to sun at all angles. Ideally, hopefully these trees are on the north side of that. The one thing you do want to try to avoid is shade. And if they are on the north side, it's going to be blocking the wind when the wind's out of the north. So that's the one thing in this picture that if we could change something to make it even better or closer to ideal, that would be the thing we'd do, is try and get further away from those trees to let more airflow through. The next thing, our round bale is an awesome invention. It allowed us to start putting hay outside. It allowed us to start shedding, using our barns or even not having a barn to do other things. But if you take a 6-foot hay bale, 6 foot in diameter around, those outside 2 inches is 11% loss if that part is what's rotted off and your animals reject it. So 11%, 2 inches, 21% just in 4 inches. The best things to do if you're storing outside, you want to have that bale packed up as tight as you can. You want to have a lot of chaff around the outside of that bale. And then ideally, if you can get the net wrap on it so that it'll hold its shape better, that's a good thing too. This one here is a hay storage cost evaluator. It's a tool that Texas A&M and Oklahoma State made together. The place to find this is on beefextension.com. It's right there on the bottom of your screen. I'll leave this up for a minute or two, let you write that down. But basically what it does, it takes you through some steps. There's some blue cells in there or some numbers that are blue. Those are items where you can put your information in, what fits your hay the best, what fits your program the best, the amount of hay, the bales that you want to store, so on and so forth. And it will calculate out how long, if you pretty much know the cost of a barn, it will tell you how long it would take to pay for a barn versus leaving your hay out in open storage. I plugged mine in, just playing with it earlier this week, and less than 5 years, I could pay for a barn in the amount of hay that I probably waste in that time. And I don't feed a whole lot of hay, so it would be pretty advantageous. So I'd recommend everybody go back after the meeting to this beefextension.com, look up the hay storage cost evaluator, plug your own numbers into it. If you got questions, you have problems trying to find it or something, you can get a hold of me. You can call Justin or your county educator, whichever county you're in. Be glad to help you find it, I'm sure. And it's pretty interesting, pretty eye-opening. I've wanted a barn for a few years, and this just kind of validated that I need to quit wanting it and start figuring out how to get it. So quality is another reason for storage. The higher quality your hay is, the more reason you got to store it properly. Whether you're buying it or whether you're rolling it up or baling it up yourself, the more it's worth, the better the quality of it is, the more you want to protect it and keep it as much of it as you can being utilized by the animal. Another option is baleage. For the most part, baleage is a high moisture, 45 to 60% forage, and it's sealed oxygen tight in this plastic wrap. There's tubes like what's in the picture. They now have machines that'll has 4 or 5 rolls of plastic on it, and it will continually go around that bale as it spins it and twists it and drop them out there in your field, and they look like little marshmallows all over the field. A few pros and a few cons. One of the big pros, like I said earlier, we got some neighbors that couldn't get their ryegrass and their wheat dried down this spring and wound up having to abandon it. With this, they could have baled it up in that high moisture, got it wrapped and rolled and stored, and turned it in almost to baleage or a silage like product. Quick con is going to be the expense of that, and then a few others. Disposal of the plastic. You're going to have a lot of trash left over from those, cutting those off. And then if it does get torn, that silage process or ensilage process stops, and you get some spoilage around that hole because it's letting oxygen in, and it changes the way that those chemical reactions are happening to inside that hay bale.
Boy, I was visiting with a gentleman today that's doing some of this.
Yeah.
And he was telling me, he said he's got some guys that he was visiting with, and he said the way they handle all that plastic is they get the hay out of that tube, and he said then they're running their round baler down through there and baling that stuff up and selling it. But he said or shipping it to recycling, but he said he's a little nervous about running his through his round baler and getting it all hung up in there. So he said some of them are doing that, but he said that's how they're disposing of all that excess plastic. But
I hadn't heard of that, but I'd wind up wrapping it around the header or something somehow.
Yeah,
have more trouble. And I do have one producer that I know of there in Hughes County. He moved up here from Texas last year, bought a really good place. It's down on river bottom, got center pivot irrigation on it. He put it in alfalfa and didn't have any barns. He dried it down just like a normal hay bale, and then he wrapped his alfalfa in these looks like a bunch of marshmallow bales, but it's dried down in a round bale alfalfa. But he did it for storage reasons, not necessarily trying to make haylage out of it, but he didn't have any place to store it, and the alfalfa is too valuable just to let sit out there stacked up on the ground, and so he wrapped all of his. So I'm waiting to see later this winter and this fall what that's going to look like and how it's going to turn out. But he told me he'd bring some in. We're gonna send a few samples off on it once he gets into it here in another few weeks, probably. This one here is just another recommendations for ground storage. The one thing I didn't mention before, if you're a small producer, don't have a lot of hay bales, the one thing you can do also is get it off the ground, stack it up on something. Some people stack them on old railroad ties, old telephone poles. I've seen some hay stacked on pallets and tires before. And what they're trying to do is get it off the ground, because the most spoilage is going to come where that hay bale contacts the ground. It's going to wick water or moisture up out of the soil and into that hay bale. And that's where the most losses come from, is across the bottom of the bale. And then a couple other things, kind of know what not to do here across the bottom. You can see where the guy left it in the field, and then he got a good heavy rain, and hay bale sitting in a low spot, literally standing in water or floating in water possibly. Stacked too close together. You can't get the air between them. Can't get the sunlight to shine down between them to dry that ground out. So they're going to sit on wet soil a lot longer. And then stacked over in the shade, same issue. Just setting them along the edge of the field. I know a lot of folks that do that just to get them out of the way, so they're ready for the next cutting when time comes. And they're stacked over along a fence line underneath the trees, or they're stacked over along a creek with a bunch of trees along the creek bank. So cautious about those if you got any way to get them out of the field and stacked up and proper before they start getting wet. You're going to be a long ways ahead when you're trying to save a little bit of hay. Percent dry matter loss on your round bales. We talked about that just a few minutes ago. The outside 2 inches is 11%. The outside 4 inches is 21%. This is just another graph telling us the same thing. Exposed hay on the ground. If you cut it this summer and feed it this winter, you can look at losing anywhere from 5 to 20% of your hay before you can get it fed up, just to spoilage sitting outside on the ground. If you bale it this summer and don't feed it all, and you got some left over to feed next winter, 15 to 50% could be lost or spoilage before you get around to getting that hay out to them next year. And then you start looking at the differences of enclosed barn, less than 2% in this first 9 months, and just 2 to 5% if it makes it all the way through the year. And a lot of times in a good barn, it's got good drainage away from it. It's less than 2 this year, and it's still right around 2 next year. Several years down the road, you may still not have lost 5% if it's completely enclosed and out of the weather, out of the wind, out of the rain, out of the sun. Dry matter in your outer layers, just like we talked about. We was using a 6-inch bale before. It gets even worse if your bales go smaller. A 5-foot bale at 4 inches is 25% instead of 21 on a 6. If you lose 6 inches of that hay, kind of what they estimate in this picture right here, on a 5-foot diameter bale, it's over a third of the hay bale that's going to be rejected. Put a dollar value to that. Drop down here where that 35% was. If you're paying $60 a bale for your hay this fall, this winter, and you lost 35%, that's $21 of your 60 that your animals are going to reject or walk away from. That still doesn't talk about shrinkage or reduced quality from setting out in the weather. That's just the part that they won't eat. So it adds up pretty quick, and that goes back to that hay storage calculator we talked about earlier. We'll move to hay feeding real quick, talk about a few differences. When you get into that, found this. See if we can, I may not be smart enough to make it work. There we go. He didn't need a ring. So you kind of look at the differences there. You got the Cadillac hay feeder up here at the top left. Estimated price, and I didn't price these. So I'm going to say somewhere in the $800 to $1,000 range. But research has shown about 5% waste, and the rest of that is consumed if you put a good high quality hay bale in there. So you're getting 95% of your hay consumed by your cows. Then you got the hay bale here where that bull in that video just went through it. And even if they don't go through it like that, research has shown about just under half of the bale to be wasted. It's either going to get defecated on, it's going to get trampled into the mud. Some weeks when it's raining and nasty out, and just a lot of hay that was good that would have been eaten, that doesn't get consumed. Just an unskirted ring, about 20%. There's two different kinds of those. This little poly one here. I actually bought one of these last year for $250. So, I mean, if they've gone up 100 since last fall, I don't know, but that's a pretty good jump. And then one with the skirt on it, metal ring all the way around it to keep the hay from falling out the bottom like they are on these two, drops you down to about 13%. Some quick math here to run through. Just a difference of 8% on your loss, and that's comparing the best two. This 13%, if you can reduce from 13 to 5, and you run 40 cows and feed hay for 120 days, that's about 6 tons less hay that you need. So if you figure up what you're paying for hay by the ton, and you can buy 6 tons less, or you can sell 6 tons because you didn't need to feed it to your own cows, put your values to it, figure out, is it worth the money to go to this Cadillac ring up here at the top? The one thing about this one at the top, you're probably going to need to fill it with a tractor and a front end loader most of the time. These others are a little more portable. You can pick them up by hand, move them around, and set them over your hay bale. This one here on the top, most folks aren't going to manhandle those and set them over their hay. You're going to have to set the hay into them.
Hey, this is Nick. Just real quick, I run Longhorn cattle, so really the only option I have of those 4 hay rings is the lower right-hand one, which is the one we use most.
Yeah. Yeah, the horn cattle are going to need something just a little bit different. But yeah, there's the one like this brown one here in the bottom right is still a good option. It's got the skirt around the bottom. It gives them the ability to get some access into it. A lot of horse people use this one also. The little cradle here is pretty popular with sheep and the goats. It keeps the hay from, they're short enough animals. They eat it out, make a mushroom out of it. And then when it falls over, you get something caught underneath it or injured when the top half falls on to the bottom half. So a lot of different options, and a lot of different scenarios. Just like Nick said, there's something out there that'll help no matter what your situation is. You may just have to hunt a little harder than just running to your local feed store to grab whatever they've got. One at the top is another one of those Cadillac type feeders. It's a different style, different brand. We're not promoting any specific brand, just trying to show the options, and the more material they got in them, usually the better they are at saving some hay. So a lot of people roll out their hay and want to feed, unroll it, let everything get to it at one time. The different options with that. They did some research at University of Arkansas and calculated about 85% utilization rolling it out. And then they got a 91% utilization by rolling it out with a hot wire across it. To me, that seems like a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of time trying to to unroll that and get the hot wire over it to keep the cows from trampling in it, walking in it, defecating in it, different things. So what they've done is they tried to figure out the best way to do that. And so they've got their hay bales lined up over here on the side with electric fence, keeping the cattle out of them. They just roll it out and then just slide the fence down 4 or 6 feet and almost make like a trough across there. It looks like a good option, good possibilities. It's going to save you about 5%, honestly, from what the research they had. You have to determine what 5% is worth. We figured out a while ago that 8% for 40 head is worth about 6 tons a year. So looking at that, it's another option. Doesn't have the cost of a hay ring, but does have the extra labor of moving a fence every time you roll out another hay bale. Let them have about half, and you got to be out there. So if you got the labor to do it, it's another good option. Quick summary on your hay storage. If you total that up, if you got in a barn like the one in the picture, they estimated from the University of Arkansas about 10% losses versus storing it outside uncovered. Even if it's rowed up and stored properly, they're estimating about 25% loss. So a 15% difference. You have to figure out how much hay you're going to go through in a year and put your calculations to that 15%. But then same way with the feeding. If you go with the basic ring that's got the skirting around the bottom of it, they're estimating about 13%. Now, I'm not sure on the 24 for unrolling. I don't know if that's a combination of what they had in their previous slide where they unrolled it and was estimating about 8 to 10%. And then they just set one out whole and was estimating up to 45%. You average those two together and you can get about that 24. And then the one thing we didn't talk about is processing the hay. And running it through some type of grinder or shredder or something and feeding it back to them in a trough. There's a little bit more of that becoming more and more popular. I've got some neighbors that are kind of doing some stocker animals, and they've got some vertical mixers. They throw a hay bale in it, add some byproducts to it, and are running it back and feeding them in a trough. But trying to make a total mixed ration with the hay included in the ration.
Boy, does that the unrolling, if you unroll more than they can eat in a day, does that probably increases that too, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And I didn't back on that one before. That's another key to the fence. You just want to give them what they're going to consume in 24 hours. So it's a everyday thing, and that's one of the things that took us to the round bales way back in the day was people could set them out and may not have to come back and feed them again for 3 or 4 days. So unrolling them, getting that waste down as low as you can requires you to move that fence, a few feet each day so that they're consuming just what they can reach. You want to get them what they need, but not get them so much that they're just gluttonous on it. So, but that's my presentation. I'll be happy to answer any questions anybody's got. If not, we will turn it over and let Mike get his in and turn mine off and let him go.
Coy, thank you very much for doing that for us this evening.
Yep. Thank you guys for sitting through it. I appreciate it.
At this time, we'll turn it over to Mike Trammell. Mike's our fairly new to extension, but has spoke to this group already once since we started. So appreciate him coming back and being with us again. So Mike, we'll turn it over to you now to talk to us about balanced forage systems.
Okay, Justin asked me to talk about balanced forage systems, and thinking about this is a pretty big topic. You could pretty much write a textbook on this, I think. And so just basically going to go through some highlights on some things, hit some of the important points in developing a balanced forage system. And with each presentation I've done over the years, I've always liked to include some old photos. Here's an old photo of a guy. This is a sheep herder in Hungary. This picture was taken by Andre Kurtz, and probably in the early 1920s. And this guy was known for taking photos of a lot of different ranches through America and farms in Europe. And he always talked about achieving what he called system balance, and how farmers and ranchers were working to achieve this in their system. And today it's kind of what we shoot for when we talk about, developing a year-round grazing system. If we could have cattle grazing 365 days a year, that puts a lot of money back into our pocket. So that's what we're going to talk about here, is a little bit about balanced forage systems and how we can kind of work toward this. So balanced forage system, basically what we're talking about is having cool and warm season forages growing during more months of the year. Basically, we're trying to develop flexibility in the operation, have places to go with those animals, have green forage as much as possible throughout the year. And we're basically trying to reduce the annual cow cost by reducing purchasing feed or haying costs, which again is money out of our pocket. But there's nothing wrong with feeding hay. And when we do feed hay, we want to feed good quality hay, and we want to kind of reduce the amount we are feeding by having those animals out there on pasture as much as possible. So that's kind of the whole idea behind the balanced forage system. And basically it's kind of walking a tightrope in a way. And it's going into a balanced forage system. There's a lot of your grazing management, how those animals graze and what their nutritional needs are during different times of the year, and what hay you are feeding. Like Coy just talked about, there's a difference between good quality and poor quality hay, and how we store that hay and how we feed it has a lot to do with the money in our operation. So why are balanced forage systems so important? Well, this is kind of Oklahoma in the summertime. We're pretty green. Maybe that's somebody's Bermuda grass field. This is us in the wintertime. We're pretty brown. We go from one extreme to the other. This is when we're out there feeding a lot of hay. That Bermuda grass doesn't have much nutritional quality that time of year, so we're feeding a lot of supplementation along with it. And so, like I said, we're spending money. And winter feeding costs account for about as much as 60% of total yearly cow maintenance costs. So every time we're unrolling hay or feeding supplement, that's affecting our bottom line. So when we look at balanced forage systems, that's what we're trying to achieve, is keep that animal out there. And you'll hear me go over some of these things over and over again, trying to make these points. It's because they're very important. It's kind of like an old gentleman told me once. That used to tell me, I'd come down to my office and tell me a lot of different stories. And he's like, "You've probably heard me tell this once, but if you have, just sit back and listen, because I like to hear myself tell it." So, and basically what we're doing is trying to make this cow into a self-propelled forage harvester and fertilizer spreader. So basically we're letting this cow do a lot of work for us. We want this cow out there consuming these standing forages, and putting money back into our pocket. And basically, if you look at this, we make the cow do the work. And we're looking at just one example. We're probably if you add about 30 days of winter grazing to your operation, that could work out to about as much as a 21-pound increase in weaning weights, 2.5% increase in weaning percentage, and almost 2 3/4% increase in current market value. So that's something to think about when you're developing a system. is getting as much grazing time as possible, especially like in a winter scenario. Like we looked at that slide earlier, from Oklahoma when it's green to Oklahoma when it's brown in the winter. So balance your forage system. If we look at the little graph down at, or a little table down at the bottom, we see growing season months by forage type. We can break this out into warm season and cool season. You can see our warm season, we're looking, this is like Bermuda grass, could be Bahia grass. We're getting growth from about May up through September. Cool season here, we're talking about maybe our small grains like wheat or triticale. Could be a perennial like tall fescue. But we're looking at, growth in March and April, October and November. Now we do have some marginal forage growth times, and basically this is when it can be really cold. And this is December, January, and February. So during these 3 months, we can have marginal growth. It depends on what the weather is, and everybody knows what it's like in this state. So we do expect some overlap in growing degree days. We could have a warm September, Bermuda grass, give us another 30 days. Other years it could be real cool. This year we had a real cool early summer, so Bermuda grass was slow to get going. In Oklahoma, our typical growing seasons, like we talked about, are warm season. This works out to about 44% of the year, or 160 days. Cool season, about 36% of the year, or 130 days. And then we, like talked about, we have about 75 days or so, 20% of the year, it's just too cold to grow, depending on average how the weather is. So a balanced forage system is we'd like to have enough warm and cool season forage production to cover most of the growing days as possible. We want to reduce that hay and feeding time. During this time, we can use some hay to cover these days, some of those days that are too cold maybe to grow any forage, or we'll talk a little bit, we can use stockpile forage to cover the remaining days. And here's a graph of some growth curves of various forages. So we have our winter annuals, like a wheat, could be a rye. The cool season perennials like tall fescue, warm season grasses, Bermudas, what we most know could be native grasses. Then we got some winter annuals where they start in the fall, and they carry over into the spring. So basically, this could represent a balanced forage systems. We have flexibility in our operation, and we have different maybe pastures of different things. We can move the animals around different times of the year. Even in this situation, though, you do see like where it's too cold to grow in certain times of the year, like here in December, maybe early January, where we may have to rely on some hay or maybe some stockpiled forages elsewhere in our operation. Here's a little different graph, kind of since we're getting close to Christmas. This is a reminder of Christmas, red and green. But you should look at native grasses, different how their growth curves are. Plains blue stem, Caucasian blue stem. I actually had a call the other day about Caucasian blue stem. Love grass, crabgrass. This is a warm season annual. Then down here there are clovers, white, crimson, arrowleaf, and then some of our small grains. Here's annual ryegrass. A lot of use of annual ryegrass in this area. So this might look a little busy, but this is the warm season growing degree days. I took this for Shawnee, just where I'm at here. This is from 1971 through 2021 of this year. You can see the black squiggly line here is this year. The line running through it is the average. The red is the maximum average highs, and there's the maximum average low. So this kind of gives you the temperatures from January through January of a year on average. And basically what we see, there's about 6 months of the year when temperatures are too low and days are too short for warm season forages like Bermuda grass to grow. Basically, what you would get is an area here in January up to about maybe April where it's very too cold for warm seasons. Then you would get an area basically starting about October 1st when warm season grasses begin to shut down and we lose that warm season growth. We also have, here's that transition zone where months can move here or there depending on the weather. You know, maybe we have a very warm spring, and so warm season grasses start growing earlier than normal, or maybe they move more into the fall. So we always have probably 30 to 45 days of shifting from year to year during this transition period. If we look at cool season growing degree days, we still see our green boxes there for our areas of transition. Basically, from about May to September, we have very, very limited cool season anything growing. But one thing we want to do note here is, you notice I've put this blue line on here. That's at about 32 degrees Fahrenheit. And then this line up here around about 70 degrees. There's a point below when it gets too cold for anything to grow. We lose any kind of growth. You can see this was February of last year, this big temperature dip. And it can get too hot for some things to grow. So, you know, if we get up, you know, too hot, we get 100 degrees, even warm seasons tend to shut down. So this is where we have forage gaps created, where if you've just got a warm season system or a cool season system, you have to rely on forages from elsewhere. So like I said, feeding cows in the winter is normally the #1 variable cost associated with owning that cow. So we want to make the cow do the work. Having a balanced forage system will help reduce hay feeding days. We want to supply quantity of forage and quality. In grazing fertilized forage, on average, a lot of times we can save up to $1 a cow per day doing that. Stockpiling fall forage production is a standing hay crop. So grazing a standing hay crop with stockpiling forages, we could use Bermuda grass, tall fescue, small grains, or native grasses. And think about growing a cool season spring forage crop. This could be annual ryegrass, clover, tall fescue, various options. And there are many different strategies when we think about this. We could fertilize at different times of the year, adding legumes to warm and cool season pastures. Maybe you only have winter annuals, and maybe you want to add a winter perennial like tall fescue. Adding a cool season winter annual. Some folks may want to add a little bit of flexibility there with a winter annual and go to the small grains or use annual ryegrass. And then stockpiling our forages for grazing later. So as we go down this, I'll kind of throw a few things out before we actually look at some systems. Some rules of thumb for fertility as we go through the next series of slides. About 50 pounds actual N to make 1 additional ton of forage for warm season grasses like Bermuda. And it's about 60 pounds actual N to make an additional ton of forage for cool season grass like tall fescue. For eastern Oklahoma, about 1 acre will produce about a ton of forage per year without fertility. You know, if you have the ability to determine forage biomass, that's great. That helps you do a little bit more strategic planning. Because a lot of times without knowing biomass, you cannot make strategic grazing decisions, especially if you're really fine tuning your operation. Like how much forage is in the paddock, or when should you move animals if you're doing multiple grazing paddock systems. Grazing stick is a lot of things people are familiar with using. Probably very few producers have a rising plate meter. Both these methods rely on a calibration where height is related to forage production that's already been determined. Kind of give you an example on this one here, this rising plate meter. Here we have 11 inches of height. As that plate sets down and rests on the grass, it comes to about 11 inches, which you converts based on an equation that's already developed, a little over 2,000 pounds or about a ton of forage in that pasture. This kind of stuff would help you fine tune your operation. You have to think about when your forage is needed. Early spring, cows are nursing calves. Maybe spring, early summer, still nursing calves, trying to rebreed those cows. Summer, putting on weight, still a little bit of nursing. Calves are out grazing. Fall, cows are putting on weight for the winter. Early winter, maintaining body weight, growing a calf, growing a fetus there. And then maintaining body weight, feeding newborns. Those are all important things there when you think about your operation and the nutritional quality of those forages you have in your system. And this is just a quick graph showing you the differences in the major forage species. Our cool season our legumes are some of the highest in quality, followed by our cool season annual grasses and then our perennials. We get down here in our warm season grasses like Bermuda, we tend to have very high production, but the quality is not quite as great. And that's really, a lot of that's based on the physiology of the plant. And also our grazing strategy has an impact as well. Harvest method, how efficient those cows are out there harvesting that forage under a continuous stocking system. We could range from 30 to 40% efficiency. And as we move up, say into a moderate rotation with 4 to 8 paddocks, that could jump to 60 to 70%. So we'll do some balanced forage strategies here in a minute, and we'll work around this 60% since we're going to use some 2 and 4 paddock rotation systems. So it's time for everybody to meet their cow. You can name your cow, whatever you want to name your cow. I bet you Brian's got a name for his cow already. But you must supply your cow with forage for 365 days of the year. Her nutritional needs change. It depends on what conditions she's in, dry, late gestation, or lactation. She needs high quality forage when lactating. Your cow weighs 1,200 pounds, and we're just going to assume her daily consumption is 30 pounds of forage per day. Now we're going to make this pretty simplified. Like I said, there's as Brian is an area livestock specialist can tell you, there's a lot of factors that can go in here, but for the presentation this evening, we'll try to keep it fairly simple. So we're going to assume our 1,200 pound cow here, she's going to consume about 30 pounds of forage a day, but she's only going to utilize about 60% of the forage you grow. So, you stick her out there in that pasture, she's going to eat about 18 pounds of forage a day and waste about 12 pounds of forage in a way. So we're going to have to put how much forage in front of this cow for her to eat, to get that amount she needs. We're going to have to put about 50 pounds of forage in front of her a day, because she's only going to be about 60% efficient to get what she needs. So that's kind of where we're working out here with our cow. So we have to think about the efficiency. Just because there's a lot of grass in front of her don't mean that she's going to eat every bite of it. Some of it she's going to turn her nose up at. And, one thing you think about, if she has a calf in spring, you'd like to have some nice green forages for her. There's a lot of nutritional things we need to think about. And, like I said, needs high quality forage in March and April to keep her calf well fed. She must increase her body condition because you want her able to rebreed easily in the spring. So going back, so overall 365 days a year, 50 pounds a day, your cow would need about 18,250 pounds for the year, or about 9 tons. Sounds like a lot, but takes a little bit to keep her maintained. So if on your operation, you only grew warm season forages, maybe we just had Bermuda grass. Remember, we had about 160 days of warm season growth. That's about 44% of the year. We have some old growth, dead standing forage during that transition time, especially into the fall with Bermuda. There might be about 55 days of that before it really collapses, or about 15% of the year. So that leaves us about 150 days where we'd have to feed hay, or about 41% of the year, almost pushing the half of the year to feed hay. So if we assume that our pastures are producing about 2 tons to the acre of production, our cow would need about 2 acres of warm season grass of green forage to keep her going. So basically we took that 9 tons there, we got 2 tons to the acre. She's going to eat 9 tons for the year. We're producing 2 tons to the acre of production for 44% of the year. Works out to about 2 acres. We got about a half acre of dormant standing forage for about 15% of the year, but she's going to need about 1.8 acres of hay production to keep her fed for 41% of the year. So it's our little bit of cowboy math we're going to do for the next few slides. So just looking at that, we'd have to grow all the forage needed for our cow for the year in 160 days. We would also have to have some dry standing forage for a few days, but we're going to have to plan on baling and feeding or buying a lot of hay. 150 days of feeding. So 50 pounds a day, that's about a little over 3.5 tons just for that cow, or about a little over 6 round bales for 1,200 pound bales just for feeding that cow. So anytime we can reduce that hay feeding, that's money back in our pocket. So let's look at a warm season grazing system only. This is a 50 cow system. We'll figure it's about 225 acres. Basically, we're looking at, we can take our 50 head here. We're combining the 2 acres that we need for that cow, plus the standing forage. So we need about 2.5 acres for that cow times 50 head. Gets up here to about 134 acres of Bermuda grass. That's 2 tons of production, because we can assume 1 ton without fertilization, but we're going to fertilize, so we can figure about 2 tons to the acre for that 134 acres. We'll get some high quality grazing in May, June, July, September. We don't know how September will be, so that's always a question mark. August, probably the forage quality a little low. You know, we might get something in October, November, December, depending on what's standing out there. It could, we just, you know, that's just depending on how the conditions are. But we're going to have to produce some hay. So again, 50 head times by that 1.8 acres that we needed for hay production, that works out to about 90 acres of Bermuda grass. Again, we're going to fertilize that to make 2 tons to the acre. We look at that, so 134 acres times 2 tons of production, 268 tons to the acre of green standing forage out there. That's about 536,000 pounds of forage to the acre. 50 cows that eat 50 pounds of forage a day, that's 25,500 pounds a day. If you divide that, we get up to 214 days of grazing. So you remember, 160 days of warm season grazing plus about 55 days of old growth. So we worked that out when we could hold those cows. Same situation here. We figured that out. We get about 144 days worth of hay produced. So that's a lot of feeding hay and a lot of, you know, feeding every day and baling hay for that type of system. So how can we reduce this 144 days over here? So we're going to try to balance our system. So what if I grew a cool season forage along with my warm? So remember, 160 days for warm season. So we got about 130 days now, or 36% of the year it's cool season. Remember, it's too cold to grow for about 75 days, or 20% of the year. Still getting our 2 tons to the acre production. So our cow would still need 2 acres of warm season forage on average, 1.6 acres of cool season forage production, and almost an acre. We've reduced that down to 0.9 now for hay or stockpiled forage. So we'll go back to our ranch here, 225 acres, and we still got our Bermuda grass over here. We've reduced it a little bit now. So we've got 50 head out here on our Bermuda grass, still grazing it. We fertilize, we got 2 tons the acre of production. Now we're only going to produce 45 acres of hay, fertilized, again, 2 tons production. I won't go through all the calculations again, but there's our 50 head times 0.9 works out to about 45 acres. So our cool season forage here, we're going to grow 80 acres of tall fescue, maybe some clover mix, fertilized with about 130 pounds of urea. Remember, so about 60 pounds of N would give us a ton of production on cool season. So we're looking at 2 tons of the acre production. We can get grazing in November, in December, March, and April out of this. We've probably reduced our hay production down to about 75 days of feeding hay from 144 just by adding this cool season forage component here. So we've cut that in half. Now we could look at the same system again with our Bermuda, still doing the 45 acres of hay. But here we could do maybe a small grain instead of tall fescue. Now that's an annual, so we're only going to get time through, we'll fertilize it September. We'll get some grazing a little bit through the winter and into the spring. But what are we going to do with that spot in the summer? We could seed that to crabgrass. So that'd give us a year-round production of an annual warm season annual and a warm season or a cool season annual on that one piece of property there. So that's another way you can break that up if you didn't want to go to a perennial, but we're still getting 80 acres of production. We just spread that over warm season and cool season annuals. Some things to think about. You know, if you're doing annuals, it usually rains in early September. We'll get some moderation of temperatures in the fall. We'll get some Bermuda grass growth in. It's usually a little higher quality. Fertilizing tall fescue can result, remember, in a ton of forage. So if we don't fertilize it, we're only looking at about a ton. But if we fertilize that stuff in the fall, we add another ton to that. We can think about stockpiling these forages for November, December. This can also reduce the days we're feeding hay and supplement. We could also look at maybe annual ryegrass and legumes. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So we're talking about some of the options you can use. What forages can I use for thinking in systems like this or stockpiling? Pretty much everything you see here on this list: Bermuda grass, native grasses, the whole world blue stem. You know, we talked about crabgrass. That's a warm season annual. There's some. We look at cool season forages, tall fescue or small grains, and we're looking at annual ryegrass and some of our clovers. One thing to remember about annual ryegrass and some of the clovers: you don't get much fall production, but you get a tremendous amount of production in early spring to early summer. So when we talk about stockpiling various forages or native grasses, those are ones we often defer grazing July through October and grazing those in the fall. Bermuda grass, pretty much the similar situation, while tall fescue is kind of the opposite. We'll fertilize and stockpile in September through October, graze in November and December, and plus maybe January and February. So we'll get some later things. Same way for the small grains. I think Justin had a series on stockpiling, so I won't go too much into that. Stockpile Bermuda grass, that works great in these systems. We want to clip or graze that pasture down to about 2 inches in height in August. And the reason to do that is we have low forage quality growth in August, so we want to remove that. Fertilize prior to Labor Day. Remember, we can add, for every 50 units we add, we can add a ton of production. Can be grazed at any time, but if you're wanting to reduce haying, keeping animals off that stockpile pasture at least till November, December. This Brian Pugh, or area agronomist in the Northeast, this is a picture of some stockpile Bermuda he took. It's another one here. We talk about tall fescue for stockpiling. Love it or hate it, still the best adapted perennial cool season forage for our area. It can produce a lot of fall forage and some pretty good production in the spring. It's well adapted to various soils, low pH and low fertility soils. Can be some toxicity issues with the endophyte on Kentucky 31, but that can be managed. And it works great throughout the country in year-round grazing systems. And this is some old data from Bob Woods, used to be the Northeast agronomist. Some studies he did up in the Northeast, basically set it up for stockpile like we just mentioned. He did this in 10 Northeast counties. He averaged a little over 3,000 pounds of acre of production. And it was, you could see 2,100 pounds above the unfertilized check. So big difference there. If it doesn't rain, don't worry about it. Fertilizer should be there for early spring growth. Tall fescue will take advantage of it, I promise you. This is a picture Brian also gave me. This is his kids standing out some stockpiled fescue, pretty good looking pasture there. So if we look at some stockpile in our operation, it was 50 cows on our 224 acres. Still have our Bermuda. in this system is our warm season forage, 100 acres of that, supporting our 50 cows. We're still doing our hay, but we broke out 40 acres of stockpile Bermuda grass, 40 acres of Bermuda grass that we stockpiled, but we also had an annual ryegrass on it for spring grazing. That'll actually reduces, if you figure that down, to about 58 days of hay, somewhere 60 days of hay. So we're reducing that number even more. So these are very general situations that I've put up here, just kind of give you an idea how to balance it out. It's all trying to fill these forage curves and reducing the amount of time you're out there feeding hay. One thing about annual ryegrass, only about 15% of its production is in the fall. The rest is in the early spring. So it can have a tendency to get away from some folks. It can produce up to 5,000 to 7,000 pounds of forage in the spring if conditions are right. Does not work well with wheat, but works great with our cereal rye and triticale. And works well overseeded with Bermuda grass if managed properly. This picture of some annual ryegrass pastures there. Very responsive fertility. You can see 0 in here compared to 60 to 180. A lot of difference in the growth. Pretty good difference in production, even between 60 and 180 pounds of N. So that brings up the question, will these systems still work without fertilizer? Yes, you'll just have to get rid of half your cows. These examples, we went from, if you don't fertilize, you can pretty much just cut it down to 25, from a 50 to a 25 cow system on this 224 acres. I mean, that's just straight math. You just wouldn't be able to support that. So fertilizer would, make it a real big difference in these types of scenarios. Again, showed this slide before, but it's just a reminder that there's a lot of different strategies. There's no one strategy that fits everybody or everybody's operation. So, if you're looking at these types of systems, what works best for you. It depends on what your soil types are, what your way your pastures flow, how you got things fenced, and how you can work these different forages into your operation and your grazing management system. So yeah, lots of choices. Just take some planning. Just got to have a plan, sit down, pencil it out, work at it, come by extension office, talk to any of us guys, and we'll help you, put together a plan, try to balance out your forage system. It's not something that happens overnight, but it's a good place to start is visit with your extension office. And hopefully we can help you develop something that's similar to a forage production planning calendar. This is pretty much got everything in the kitchen sink on it. Not that we want to see that everything on it, but it gives you an idea of the different options out there that might be able to work through your system, depending on where you are. With that, summarize things. Hey, any way you can reduce the amount of hay you're feeding, and it's going to save you time and money. Fall fertilizing, stockpiling Bermuda grass can give you some nutritious growth in the fall and help reduce your winter feeding periods. Growing tall fescue or an annual ryegrass, good way of reducing winter feeding costs. Maybe we're going to do a small grain. Do a forage budget. Here's the link to OSU Extension Guide. I'll bring that up here in a minute. Fit your cow herd and your forage production credentials. And each soil will react differently to fertilizer application. May take some time to get your system running smoothly. Be sure to bring, some soil samples into the office. Let us look at it and help you work on your system. This is a good resource to kind of help you get started. You can download this off the OSU website for forage budgeting guidelines. Talks in there, small ruminants, cattle, different forages. Gives you kind of a general idea of some things that you may be interested in if you're looking at developing a balanced system. And with that, I'll take any questions. That's like trying to put a textbook into 30 minutes or so.
Mike, I'll start you off. The native grass, when you're thinking about that grazing late in the wintertime, you're kind of hoping to wait for it to freeze, right?
Yes. Yeah. And basically, you kind of want it to freeze and then use that grass really before it collapses in the dead of winter. So there's actually a point there we can wait too long and it just kind of falls apart. Bermuda grass will do that too. Not careful.
Guys, thank you for tuning in. We ended up having a decent little crowd, so appreciate all of you being here with us. And we will, our next and final meeting for the Forage class will be December the 16th. We will be discussing stocking rates and forage budgeting. So you kind of talked a little bit about that tonight. So that is good, because I know that's kind of on a lot of people's minds right now is price of fertilizer and what can we do about that. And unfortunately, there's not a whole lot you can do about high fertilizer. Either you buy it or you cut back your stocking rates. And so there's maybe a few things you can do to manipulate that, but not many. So appreciate everybody being here with us, and we'll meet, like I say, December the 16th, 6 o'clock. That'll be our wrap up meeting for this series. So appreciate all of you. And if you have any questions, just let us know. We'll end at this time. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Coy. Have a good evening, guys.